Okay. All right. So 70 years ago today, the U.S. detonated its most large nuclear weapon in the Marshall Islands on Bikini Island. It was 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This day, we remember the victims of Castle Bravo nuclear blast and all of the other victims of radiation that they ask us to remember when we're doing this. So we have, the beginning of the nuclear cycle, indigenous people and 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in the United States, the Church Rock uranium tailings spill into the Rio Puerco, which was more release than Chernobyl, the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945, just before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that exposed people in New Mexico, but also throughout North America. The nuclear testing victims in Nevada, the Marshall Islands, many other places around the world where other countries were doing testing. And the people of the Marshall Islands, instead of being given treatment, were exposed, their exposure and effects were used for human radiation experiments. Also, the atomic veterans, military people who were exposed to the blasts, and the atomic cleanup veterans who created the Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands. Also, people living near the meltdowns, Santa Susana Field Lab, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and other places where there have been meltdowns. In learning about the Marshall Islands, the Golden Rule Project visited with the UN representative to the Marshall Islands, Ambassador Kabua, and we discussed what's going on in the Marshall Islands today. And so one thing is that although our radiation or nuclear testing caused a lot of radiation-based cancer, there's no chemotherapy facility anywhere in the Marshall Islands. Marshall Islanders, just like the indigenous people in the United States, volunteer at a higher rate for the US military, and there's no VA clinic in the Marshall Islands to help them through the specific injuries of war. Also, for the last 3 decades, the Marshall Islanders have sought compensation in the US for the health and environmental effects of nuclear testing. They've been denied standing to sue the US government in our courts, and our Congress has denied their requests. There's a compact of free association that governs the relationship between the United States, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. This was renegotiated in 2023, right before it was due to expire, but Congress has yet to fund the $7 billion that's been approved. Marshallese moved to the United States. I know that Ivana is going to be visiting one community. We visited Marshallese in Hawaii, in Dubuque, Iowa, where they greeted the Golden Rule with beautiful melodies. And then finally, regarding the Marshall Islands, you probably all know about the Runit Dome that contains plutonium from the Castle Bravo test. It also contains other nuclear test material, both from the Marshall Islands and Nevada. And this is a further victimization of the Marshallese people because they can't live near there. But also climate change, which they don't really contribute to, is causing sea levels to rise and consume their islands. And that includes the Runit Dome. So there's no better way to remember the victims of Castle Bravo and other nuclear victims than by taking action on behalf of them and pushing for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So you can let your senator and representative know that you fully support funding the Compact of Free Association, and tell them that you support the Radiation Compensation and Exposure Act, including its expansion to include the people exposed to the Trinity test in New Mexico. The Nuclear Ban Treaty Collective has a really great resource page that you can go to find out more about how you can act locally and statewide and federally. And you can ask your congressional representatives to support certain legislation that will take us back from the brink of nuclear war and other measures to redirect money from nuclear weapons spending to energy and clean energy, non-nuclear, non-carbon, and to human needs. Thank you.
Unmuting myself. Thank you, Helen, for that important remembrance and the relevant actions that we can take. Now to get to the essence of this important webinar presentation, over 300 people have registered for this webinar, and I think we're up to getting close to 150 or so that are with us right now. Others who who registered but are not here will receive a recording of this webinar, and as will all of you. Please put your questions and comments in the chat. There's no Q&A. We're in a meeting format, Zoom meeting instead of Zoom webinar, so there's not a Q&A option. So we'll be monitoring the chat for your questions. And you may notice that you're all muted, and you'll probably be remaining muted throughout. So the chat is your best way to communicate with us. There's otherwise too many of us people to be having people speak up. But feel free to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're zooming in from and put your questions there. Okay, now on to our first speaker. Dr. Ivana Nikolic-Hughes is president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and a senior lecturer in the discipline of chemistry at Columbia University. Her work on ascertaining the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands has been covered widely. Dr. Hughes currently serves as a member of the Scientific Advisory Board to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we're so happy to have you with us, Dr. Hughes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm so happy to be with everyone. I've prepared some slides and I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. Oops, oh, sorry. Somehow I ended up in the wrong place. All right, there we are. Can everyone see my slides? Yes? Okay, perfect. Well, let me just thank all of you for being here tonight, and let me thank Jerry and everyone at Veterans for Peace for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you all. I'm especially excited to be doing this webinar with Timon Wallace. There are really few people with whom I agree on issues as vehemently as I do with Timon, so it's really a special treat to be doing the webinar together. Typically, when I teach or speak about both climate change and nuclear weapons issues, I spend a good deal of time kind of laying the foundation for what it is that we know about these issues so that we can understand the urgency in addressing them, so that we can understand them for the existential threats that they are. And then towards the end, I usually sort of have to muster enough energy and enthusiasm to convince everyone that we will, in fact, that we can and will, in fact, address them, and thus ensure that humanity will continue for generations to come. Tonight, it's going to be Timon's role to give you all the hope and all the solutions. So I just get to be the doom and gloom lady, and that's going to be my role. So I'm referring to sort of my part of the presentation as the lessons from science. Why are these threats so serious, and why must we address them? I also really want to thank Helen for the insightful remarks about both Castle Bravo and all of the many victims around the world of nuclear technologies. So not just nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. I just want to point out that right now in the Marshall Islands, it's actually March 1 and just a little past noon time. And the Bravo test, in fact, took place in Bikini Atoll on March 1, early in the morning. And by about noontime is when the fallout, the radioactive fallout, reached Rongelap Atoll, where people were living at the time. And the children were infamously playing in the fallout, thinking that it was snow. By nighttime, everyone was very, very sick. But I think there's just a really, truly a kind of special symbolism that we're having this event exactly 70 years later. And of course, as Helen pointed out, the Marshall Islands specifically were not just victim to the nuclear legacy, but also to what is currently happening with climate change. So I've divided this into two pieces. I'm going to talk a little bit, just really some lessons, some snippets of what we know about climate change, and then I'll move to nuclear weapons, and then let Timon give you, as I said, hope and solutions. So on climate change, I know people in this meeting, don't need to be convinced that climate change is real, that it's happening, that it's us, but I still think it's really valuable to just examine for a little bit what it is that we really know, and what are the data, where is this coming from, and how do we know that it's not just some kind of change in the climate that happens without our interference. And in fact, how do we even know that it's fossil fuels specifically? So this first slide is just simply, what do we know? What do we observe? These are just measurements. And the first is that we know that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing, and it's been increasing rapidly. And we have followed this. In fact, there was a visionary scientist named Charles Keeling who started making measurements at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii back in 1958. And so you can see this curve showing us that CO2, carbon dioxide, has increased in the atmosphere more than 100 parts per million. So it started at less than 320 parts per million, and it's now, in the last couple of years, gone over 420 parts per million. And I just want to point out two features of this graph. The first is this characteristic wiggle. This has to do with the seasonal changes in CO2. So in the spring, when plants in the northern hemisphere begin to take CO2 from the atmosphere, the concentration goes down. And then in the fall, when leaves start to fall, and all throughout the winter, that concentration increases. So we have this yearly wiggle. But over time, don't mind the wiggle, the whole thing has been increasing. And in fact, if you look at how it was increasing in, say, the 1960s, if that rate had continued, today would be at something like 380 parts per million. But of course, we're at over 420 because the rate of increase has in fact been increasing. So what? Why is this important? Why does this matter? It seems like we're looking at parts per million, so it's not clearly not a huge amount of CO2. Well, it turns out that in addition to CO2 increasing over the same time period, the temperature has been increasing as well. And in this graph, what we're looking at is the global average temperature since 1880, since we sort of began collecting this kind of data using thermometers. And here, this line in the middle is what is referred to as the mid-20th century average. And so we see that up until about 1960, 1970, temperatures were in general lower than this mid-20th century average. And since that time, they have been increasing, and in fact, increasing quite dramatically. So it appears that the CO2 concentration rising is happening at the same time the temperature is also rising. And so this gives rise to the question of whether this is just something unusual, something recent, or whether in fact there is a relationship between greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular, and temperature. And what we do know is that these two factors, if you will, have been in fact correlating and we're now looking at hundreds of thousands of years worth of data. So in this graph, what I'm showing you is in blue, the temperature record, in red, the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And over here on the right, 0 means present. And then as we go towards the left, we're looking at the past. And we can go up to about 400,000 years back. And we see this very tight correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. We see that when one increases, the other does too. When one decreases, the other does too. And by now you must be wondering, wait a second, we didn't have thermometers 400,000 years ago. How do we know this? How do we get data such as these? And the answer comes from something we call ice cores. We're able to drill ice cores in places like Greenland. In fact, these data are from Greenland. And in those ice cores, what we end up finding is annual layers of ice. And when you drill, it turns out that when you drill up to 2-mile-long ice cores, you can get up to hundreds of thousands of years worth of data. And essentially, these are sort of preservations of ancient ice. And in fact, inside the ice, you'll see these little dots here. Those are all air bubbles. And so the ice is not just giving us information from the ice about things like temperature, it's also trapped. It has also trapped ancient air, which can tell us what the concentrations of CO2 were like. And so we see from this, right? So I told you previously that our concentration of CO2 now is at over 420 parts per million. We see here the CO2 over the last 400,000 years has basically ranged from 180 to about 280 parts per million. And then today, the concentration of 420 parts per million would be up here. So there's nothing natural about what is currently happening with CO2, absolutely nothing natural. And we in fact understand the relationship between CO2 and temperature. We understand that when we receive incoming energy from the sun, some of that energy gets reflected back out into space, either off the atmosphere, like clouds, or off of surfaces on the earth, like ice and snow, desert. But some of the incoming energy basically gets absorbed by the earth, gets re-radiated back out into the atmosphere as heat. And it's that heat that greenhouse gases trap. And the more greenhouse gases you have, the higher the temperatures on the planet will be. And so in terms of consequences, we're all aware of some of the consequences. Some of them we seem to be experiencing personally now on an increasingly on an increasing kind of time scale. One of them, of course, is the melting of ice that can happen with ice that's already in the oceans. When that happens, that amount of incoming energy that gets reflected off of the surface of the earth goes down, so more of it gets absorbed. So this leads to higher temperatures. And if that ice is in fact on land, then it goes into the oceans, which leads to sea level rise. And this is, of course, an ongoing concern. We also we've been experiencing it. I know people are here from all around the country, and we've been experiencing wildfires at different levels right now in Texas. There are wildfires and thousands of acres burning. In fact, there was news yesterday about a nuclear weapons facility, a facility that is used for disassembling nuclear weapons, actually having to be evacuated due to the wildfires. So we're really, I mean, this is just going to compound so many other issues and concerns that we have. And finally, I just want to show you this graph, which basically illustrates that just over the last about 20 years, it's both the wet extremes, so storms and wet extreme events, and dry extremes, so droughts, have really been dramatically increasing. And so what people are sort of experiencing, you know, subjectively is really happening and can be seen in the data. So I'm going to stop on climate change here, and we'll be happy at the end to take questions. So let me go into the doom and gloom of nuclear weapons. And I want to just share kind of three sort of separate stories, but really they're all related, and in some ways they all come back to Helen's points about nuclear victims. So I'll talk a little bit about some radiation impact data from Japan and what it is that we have learned from that. I'll talk a little bit about, and this is actually my own work at Columbia University with colleagues and students. And so I'll talk a little bit about what it is that we know about the Marshall Islands today. And then I'll talk about the potential victims, the victims that really what nuclear war today in the future could do to humanity. And I want to just say a few words about nuclear winter. So on Japan, and these are data from a biologist, Mary Olson, who has analyzed data that come from a survey following the radiation victims, people exposed to radiation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so these data are basically telling us about the increased risk of cancer for people who were exposed to radiation. And what we're seeing here on the x-axis is the age that someone was when they were exposed to radiation. And then you can sort of think of this y-axis as that increased risk of acquiring cancer at some point in one's life. And what's really striking about these data are that we see these two curves, right? The first striking feature is that we see that the younger someone is at the age of exposure, the higher the risk that they will obtain cancer later in life. And of course, we also see the striking thing of the two curves meaning that females at basically all ages are more prone to getting cancer later in life than males at those same ages. And in fact, the comparison between an infant girl and a 30-year-old male is a 30-year-old female actually is a 7 fold difference. So really, really important to keep in mind both these gender and age differences. Radiation does not impact all of us in the same way. The second thing I want to just say, and we sort of started talking about this already in terms of what happened around the world with the different nuclear testing programs. This map is showing you basically all of the nuclear testing sites around the world. The different colors refer to different countries, and the fact that, for example, France tested in both Algeria and in French Polynesia. The Soviets tested in a region called Novaya Zemlya and Kazakhstan, and also throughout the Soviet Union. The United States tested in the Pacific, in Nevada, in Alaska. These were mostly underground tests. The UK tested in Australia and in Kiribati. The Chinese tested in Western China. So really there was testing around the world. And I'd say it's probably fair to say that the lion's share of it took place in the Pacific. So the Marshall Islands turns out to have been actually the first major nuclear testing program. It's a testing program the United States began in 1946, just basically 6 months after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US was in the Marshall Islands getting ready for the testing. Marshall Islands are just north of the equator and just west of the international date line. And this is the map. It's a collection of 29 coral atolls and 5 islands. And just for kind of sense of scale, this is about 1,000 miles across what you're looking at here. And down here in the south is Madura, where today they're having Bravo Remembrance Day. And this is Madura, a photograph of Madura that I took in 2018. So on the map, it sort of looks like these are islands, but really they're coral atolls. There's very little land. There's sort of thin rims, volcanic rims with very little land and very large lagoons. So from 1946 till 1958, the United States tested 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, and their total energy yield, the total energy of these tests was equivalent to more than 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. And so this was just a really enormous nuclear testing program. And of course, Bravo was the largest test and also the one that ended up in this both catastrophic exposure of people living on nearby atolls, as well as significant contamination that is present to this day. So the Columbia group, we had a Columbia team that traveled to the northern Marshall Islands, and we actually visited 4 atolls. One is Bikini, where testing was done. Testing was also conducted on Eniwetok. And as I mentioned, people in Rongelap were exposed to large amounts of fallout, also Utrecht. And the US has since recognized other atolls, up to 13 atolls, as having been affected specifically by the Bravo test. And so what I want to show you, we actually traveled to all 4 of these, made a lot of different kinds of measurements, but I just want to show you one type of measurement specifically for Bikini Island. And just to give you a sense that this radiation is still there, and it's actually still not safe for people to live there. So that measurement has to do with a radioactive isotope called cesium-137 in the food. And we made measurements in coconuts, in breadfruit, in pandanus. These are the staples of the Marshallese diet. And before I show you actual data, I just also want to give you a sense for just how much the standards that are used around the world for this kind of contamination, how much they vary. So our friends at the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War have their own standard that they have set for presence of this particular isotope in the food. And then you have a whole host of national standards that range from about 40, 50, and then all the way to 1,200 for the US FDA, which has the highest, the most permissive standard. So let me show you what this looks like in terms of data. Sorry, in terms of data for the Marshall Islands. So what we did is we sort of translated some of those limits that you saw in the table into colors. So the green was lower than the limits by Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, which were all set following the Chernobyl disaster. Blue is in compliance with the Japanese limit for most foods. Yellow violates the Japanese standard, but is in compliance with the EU, European Union standard. And then we have orange, which violates the European Union standard, but doesn't violate the US FDA standard. And then we have red for the US FDA. And when you look at fruits, in Bikini Atoll, what you see is that we did not find any fruit that were at levels that correspond to the green color. We found just a few that correspond to the blue color. Most of the fruits were actually in the yellow range, so violating the Japanese standard. A few violated the European Union standard, and several even violated the US FDA standard. And so among other measurements that we were able to make in Bikini and elsewhere, this one measurement very strongly suggests to us that Bikini really must be clean before a multi-generational community can live there. So the last thing I'm going to say, this will take just a few minutes, is on nuclear winter. So I wanted to have some sort of an image with this, and I typed into Google nuclear winter, and there's a whole thing of art on nuclear winter. So what is nuclear winter? What do we mean by that? And I want to just explain that this is a concept that we have known about really since the early 1980s. Back then, people had actually learned that 65 million years ago, what happened to the dinosaurs was that an asteroid had hit the Earth, causing fires all around, and then causing a period of extreme cooling in the environment, which led to this enormous and tremendous mass extinction around the planet. And I'll explain what happens with the fires, but when this discovery was made, people really wanted to know whether there were conditions, whether there was something that could happen on Earth today that would cause similar conditions. And they realized that in fact, nuclear war could cause conditions that lead to nuclear winter. So what do we mean by that? In a nuclear war, where many cities, many places are attacked with nuclear weapons, there would be widespread fires, which would lead to a release of soot into the atmosphere, which would then block incoming sunlight. Remember how I said some of the sunlight gets reflected off the clouds? Well, this kind of amount of soot would block incoming sunlight to such a degree that the temperatures around the planet would basically go down dramatically. The estimates are 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. And in turn, this would lead to dramatic reductions in agricultural output, dramatic reductions in available food. And so scientists have done simulations of trying to figure out what would happen under different kinds of scenarios of nuclear war, and how many people would be affected. And so I'll just share this middle scenario here, which is for India and Pakistan, using all of their nuclear weapons currently. And if they were to do that, 127 million people would die from the attacks themselves. But when we look into the impact of nuclear winter and starvation, and this is starvation of people by the end of year 2 from nuclear war, the amount of people who would die around the planet would be over 2 billion people. In the case of a nuclear war between US and Russia, the number of direct casualties is 360 million, and the number of people dying from starvation is over 5 billion. So on that very depressing and kind of scary note, I will end here and hand it off to Jerry back to introduce Timon, but to Timon to give us some hope on how exactly we're going to address these threats, and how we're going to ensure that humanity, in fact, can thrive and survive for generations to come. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana Hughes. There is a bit of doom and gloom, but you present it cheerfully nonetheless. And it's a great great slides. A number of people in the chat have asked if those slides will be available to folks, and I think that they will be. Is that correct? That's great.
I'm happy to, yes.
Yeah. And I just wanted to mention briefly that another important development in Veterans for Peace the last couple of years is our climate crisis and militarism, which is a national project now. And they have some great resources on the VFP website explaining in some detail how militarism contributes to global warming and the climate crisis, and with the U.S. military actually being the largest consumer of oil in the world, and then going to war for oil. And of course, war and war preparations are very, very bad for the climate. This is something, a perspective that was actually taboo until a couple of years ago. You couldn't even get anybody in the UN to talk about it. But now it's becoming a little bit better known, and as an important element of addressing climate change is to reduce militarism overall. And I thank the number of Veterans for Peace members who are on this call today, who are active participants in the VFP Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. Okay, next we have Dr. Timon Wallace. He is Executive Director of Nuclear Ban US, and he's coordinator of the National Warheads to Windmills Coalition. Timon has a BA in Human Ecology and a PhD in Peace Studies, and has been writing, teaching, and campaigning on the issues of climate and nuclear weapons for many years. His book, Disarming the Nuclear Argument, contributed to the negotiations which led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and earned ICANN its Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And Timon's most recent book, Warheads to Windmills, Preventing Climate Catastrophe and Nuclear War, was published just recently in December 2023, and I guess it's going to be widely available now. So welcome, Dr. Timon Wallace. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks to Ivana for the great presentation. And I'm sorry you had to be the doom and gloom lady. But I'm very glad to be the hope and solutions person. That's very exciting, and of course I'm excited to be here with Veterans for Peace. I mean, you're a fantastic long-term commitments to these issues, and the work that you've done are truly inspiring, and so I'm very grateful to be with you all here. And I know that you've all that many of you have been doing this work for decades and decades, and have lots of valuable experience, and I hope I can contribute something to that. But the question that I put is, we are facing doom and gloom. There's no question about it. We are facing a climate catastrophe and the possibility of nuclear war that's both of them are increasing every day. And what can we do about it? And so my book that I've written, I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, let's see if this works. Yep. So I have just written this book, Warheads to Windmills, and it's in 4 sections, and the first 2 Ivana has just covered, really looking at the problems and why we must address these with great urgency. And I'm going to focus on the last 2, and mostly on the last one altogether, which is about the solutions. But just before we get to that, I just wanted to say a little bit about the connections, because the whole idea of Warheads to Windmills is that there are very deep and important connections between these 2 existential threats to humanity. And we just heard about one, that the wildfires in Texas caused by climate change are threatening a nuclear weapon factory. But there are many others, and starting with the fact that they're both existential threats. You can't escape them. You can't solve the climate crisis in Massachusetts or in California and not be affected by what happens in the rest of the world. And the same with nuclear war. Obviously, these affect all of us, and we have to address them as a whole country. But the good news is that one of these crises requires a huge amount of resources and energy and input and money to solve, and that's the climate crisis. We're not going to just solve it overnight. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work, but we have the money and the technologies and the infrastructure, the laboratories, the scientists, the engineers. We have the brain power. We have the jobs that could be used to fix the climate. They're all currently being wasted on nuclear weapons development and other weapon systems. One very good example is the fact that we need STEM students coming out of universities who have the kind of scientific skills that Ivana has, and they're being immediately going into working on weapons when we need them to be fixing, developing better batteries, better systems of transportation, new ways of using the sun and the wind and so on. We need these people, and we need those resources. Literally trillions of dollars are being earmarked already for nuclear weapons over 30 years from now. And yet we need those trillions to address the climate. And as I said, we can't solve this on our own. And, it just so happens that the largest emitters of carbon dioxide on the planet, namely, Russia, China, India, US, Europe, are all pointing nuclear weapons at each other. So they're clearly, we cannot solve the climate without solving the fact that we're all enemies and building a whole new generation of weapons to protect ourselves supposedly from each other. But another thing that to me makes the link so important is that we've had decades and decades of attempts to solve these problems. We've had test bans, we've had non-proliferation treaty, we've had cuts in numbers, cuts of different kinds of systems with nuclear weapons. With the climate, we've had the coal to gas transition, where shut down coal plants but build natural gas plants to take their place. We've had all kinds of attempts to blame ordinary people for the climate crisis, or for eating meat or whatever it is, when in fact we know that we have to take drastic, bold, urgent, radical action, not just to address nuclear weapons, but also to address the climate crisis. It's not going to be solved. We just had the largest budget agreed, last year, 2 years ago, for addressing the climate in the Inflation Reduction Act, and yet the climate is still getting worse every year. We're not addressing it. We're not dealing with the scale of the problem that we're facing. So they both need that. And what is stopping that from happening? And that's where I really want to focus the rest of my presentation. The reason we're not getting the action we need to address fossil fuel burning is because the fossil fuel companies are making so much money, and they're in the way of addressing this issue. They have been for decades, and they use their money to bribe and cajole the members of Congress and the White House and other politicians to make sure they don't do what's needed to be done. Exactly the same with nuclear weapons. It's the defense contractors. They're making millions, they're making trillions, altogether. And they put a small amount of that, a few millions, into bribing our politicians. And in exchange, they get billions of tax money for their contracts. That's 1,000% return on investment. It's a pretty good deal that they're getting. So here's some of the companies we're talking about. You all know them: Honeywell, BAE, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and so on. These companies are the reason that we have nuclear weapons at all in the world right now. I mean, there are other factors, but without the influence of these companies on Congress, especially, but on the media, on all kinds of things, we would be way better off in the direction of nuclear disarmament. And we've got to address these companies. And here's the ones that are in the way of addressing fossil fuels. Shell, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, BP. These companies are making billions, and unless we can really address these companies. Now, I spend all my time, lots of my time in Washington and in state houses and talking to politicians and, trying to get bills passed, as many of you, I'm sure, have done for many, many years. We got to keep doing that. We got to keep talking to our members of Congress, but we've got to address these companies. And this is where it gets exciting, because, no, not yet. So here is just a sort of summary of what we're up against. So, you have the voters here, and they elect the senators and Congress people, and they go on committees, and they should do their job. But no, they've got money going into these corporate contractors. They got revolving doors where people just get, if the lobbyists pay for their re-election campaigns. If they lose, they get a job with the company. It goes round and round, as we know. The Secretary of Defense even now is directly come from Raytheon. The campaign contributions go into influencing the voters, as does all the influence on the media, think tanks, NGOs. It's all a legalized bribery, and we've got to address that. And the good news is that we can. And I'm going to jump over our little rogues gallery here to the secret weapon that we have, which you all know what it is, but you might not have thought of it as a secret weapon. But we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the reason I call it the secret weapon is because this treaty is not what a lot of people think of it as being. It doesn't outlaw nuclear weapons in the traditional sense. It only applies to the countries that have signed and ratified the treaty, which is now 70, which is very important. We're going to get onto that in a second. But what this treaty does is prohibit everything to do with nuclear weapons, developing, testing, producing, and so on. And this is our favorite clause, Article 1E, which is the assistance clause, and it says it's prohibited to assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity that is prohibited by the treaty. Now, that is a hugely important clause, and it's not new to the nuclear ban treaty. It's in many, many other treaties, and that's why we have reasons to be excited about it. Because in the cluster munitions treaty, for example, which the US has never signed, as you probably know, but is still heavily influenced by it, because most of the rest of the world has signed it. And countries that have signed the cluster munitions, many of them have subsequently committed to the assistance clause, meaning that investment in these weapons is also prohibited. And not only public investment by the country, but private investment, and even participation in companies that are making those weapons. And that is where it gets significant. These are some of the penalties for violating the investment clause of the cluster munitions, not the nuclear weapons, but the cluster munitions. As you can see, Belgium, jail sentence of 1 month to 5 years. That's not so bad. Netherlands, up to €1 million fine. Spain, 5 to 10 years in prison. That's all, not good if you're involved in any way whatsoever with the cluster munitions. But here is my favorite law of all times, the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act of the Republic of Ireland. Now, I don't know if there's people here who are abolitionists in terms of prisons, but in my opinion, all the people that are in prison right now should be let out, and all the people that belong in prison should be put in there. And this is one of the places where this treaty, this law in Ireland prohibits anyone in Ireland from having anything to do with nuclear weapons. And that includes directors, managers, secretaries, and other officers of the body corporate. In other words, companies that are involved in the development, production, or the manufacture of nuclear weapons in Ireland could be held under this law, and anybody involved in any other way with nuclear weapons. Now, what is the penalty for that? Well, down here under 4A, you could get a fine, or you could get imprisonment for life, or such lesser term as the court may determine, or both. Imprisonment for life in Ireland for having anything to do with nuclear weapons. Well, that's a good reason to celebrate, in my opinion, what Ireland is doing. And this is just a little example of what you might think about if you're the CEO of Honeywell or General Dynamics or one of these other companies, and you want to go on a golf trip to Ireland. You might think twice about that. Now, we want more countries doing this, because this is the powerful way of putting pressure on these companies. Switzerland, which is not even a party to the treaty yet, also has very clear prohibitions about financing, including indirect financing of what they call controversial weapons, which includes nuclear weapons. And so the more countries that do this, the more pressure there's going to be on these companies who are going to see countries like Switzerland, Ireland, but more and more countries like this passing laws and eventually implementing those laws and starting to arrest people. So this is our beautiful symbol of peace, the dove, as you know, and we like to think of it as we're all here for peaceful purposes, but we need more than just a peaceful dove to be able to get rid of nuclear weapons or fossil fuels. I'm going to talk about fossil fuels in a moment, but we need not just the dove of peace, but we need a dove with teeth. And that's what we have with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We have legislation, legally binding laws in different countries. We have violations that include prison sentences for investing in these companies. And so just to take a quick look, I don't know if you can see this map very well on your screens, especially if you're on a phone or something, but these are the countries so far who have signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. There's a lot more that you can't see because they're tiny islands like the ones in the South Pacific that you were just looking at with Ivana. But you can see some, quite a few countries in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. Now, some of these countries are important for economic reasons with the United States. For instance, the Philippines, Malaysia, these are countries that we have huge amounts of business with, and they're totally on board with the treaty. Mexico, our neighbor, which is one of the largest countries on the planet with population-wise, and a very, very important partner to the US, is very, very party to the treaty. And there are other countries, as you see, besides Ireland. There's also Austria in Europe, and South Africa, and other countries that are going to be impinging on the way on business as usual for these companies in the US. These are the next 30 or so countries that are in the process of ratifying the treaty, and you'll see there Brazil, which I think is the third or fourth or fifth largest country in the world in terms of population, as is Indonesia. These are huge countries, and more of them in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. But then these are the countries added to those who have voted for the treaty. Now, these countries voted to adopt the treaty in 2017, and they've continued, most of them, every single year. It comes up in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, and they vote in favor of countries signing and ratifying the treaty. They have not done so themselves yet, so we got to keep working on them. But you'll see a lot of countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Egypt, Oman, and so on. These countries, as you I'm sure know, have a lot of military connections with the United States, and these companies have important markets, customers, suppliers, and so on, investors. I mean, these are big, wealthy oil countries. This is going to more and more impact on the companies that make nuclear weapons. And then we have European countries, Australia, Japan, Canada. These countries have enormous public support for this treaty and for their countries to sign the treaty. And I don't know if you're all familiar with the ICANN pledge, but thousands of parliamentarians in countries that have not yet joined the treaty have signed this pledge, including, as you can see, the Prime Minister of Iceland, the Prime Minister of Australia, in fact, is a signer of the ICANN pledge. But you can see down here, the majority in Scotland, huge numbers in Germany and Italy of their parliaments. And what is happening now is, for instance, in Spain and in Germany, they have coalition governments who have committed to signing the treaty. I mean, they haven't done it yet, but they are on their way. There's huge popular support for this. There's huge numbers in their parliaments, and the governing parties support signing the treaty with some conditions. But and Australia is another one which is certainly close to being one of the first of the sort of close U.S. allies to sign this treaty. But these countries now, if you add them in, Australia, Japan over there on the east, and then European countries like Germany. Germany's going to be huge. Germany is going to sign this treaty. Mark my words, they are going to sign it. And I don't know when, but they're poised to do that. It's going to be a huge impact on the U.S., not just on the companies, but on the U.S. military operations and NATO and all the rest of it. But the biggest factor is on the companies, and I want to just show you very, very quickly. These are some of the countries that the nuclear weapons companies work in. And as you can see, here's Honeywell. It's operating in 110 countries, including most of the countries that are already in the treaty, and many more that will be joining it soon. Here's Jacobs, another major nuclear weapons company. You can't see as well from this map where they are, but you can see they're all over the place. Airbus, which is a European company, again, all over Central America, South America, Africa, Middle East. Thales, which is helps make the nuclear weapons for France, again, all over the map. Raytheon. Now here you can see, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see how important the the Middle Eastern countries are going to be when they start joining the treaty, as they have promised to do. There are many countries in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and so on, who have very important links with these companies. And when they start joining the treaty, you can see here again Bechtel with all those countries in the Middle East, Boeing, you can see again Saudi Arabia, and so on. These companies are facing pressure. Now, this is I'm going to skip over these now. This is the Indian, the Indian manufacturer of India's nuclear weapons, one of them. And even China and even Russia has private companies involved in making their nuclear weapons. And you see here this Russian company that makes planes. It also makes nuclear weapons for Russia. And you can see down at the bottom there, Peru, Azerbaijan, Egypt, Kazakhstan, Indonesia. These are all countries that are going to be party to the treaty, if not now, then soon. And so this is how the pressure is being put on these companies, already is being put, in fact. We know of at least 2 companies who have pulled out of the nuclear weapons business already because of the pressure coming from mostly from Europe. But we'll talk more about that. The Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign, where there's now $4 trillion being withheld from these companies. And I just want to run through these terms that are what these companies are worried about. The first one, legislative risk, is about being illegal in some of these countries, and this is the same with the fossil fuels. By the way, you hear a lot about stranded assets further down there on the list when it comes to fossil fuel companies, because their value as a company is hugely dependent on the oil that they claim is going to be their future revenue. Well, if the world says no, we're not letting you take that oil out of the ground anymore, then their companies are suddenly worthless, literally. So stranded assets are important for the fossil fuel companies, but they're also important for the nuclear weapons companies, because as these countries start putting more and more pressure on them, their investments in factories, in personnel, in all kinds of technologies that they want to be able to promote later, those are assets which are going to become worthless if we decide as a world to stop making nuclear weapons, which we're going to. But these other things, reputational risk, this is a hugely important one, because our goal is to stigmatize these companies as doing something that's illegal, immoral, unsociable, and unacceptable, and that affects their reputation. And this is something I only learned. I mean, I'm not an economist, but you think of the value of a company like Boeing or Coca-Cola or whatever, and I think that, well, that value comes from them selling a lot of Coca-Cola, but in fact, the value of Coca-Cola comes from the name Coca-Cola. And the same goes with Boeing. The same goes with a lot of these companies. Their value is very much dependent on these intangibles, which determine whether people like them or not. And we've got to change the narrative so that people do not like Honeywell because they make nuclear weapons. And until they stop making nuclear weapons, people are going to like them less and less. So investor anxiety is when people start divesting, and that's a very important one. But we've also got all these other issues, including the fact that these are people, and they have families, and they have colleagues, and they care about what people think about their work. And a huge part of the incentive for people to work in these companies is that they're thinking they're doing something great. They think they're protecting the U.S. from its enemies, and if they're fossil fuel companies, they're keeping our lights on, and they're important companies, and that value is hugely important at a personal level, and we've got to shake that. We've got to push on these companies, and that's why we have this opportunity now to actually get rid of nuclear weapons and burning of fossil fuels, which sadly previous generations didn't have the same opportunity that we have now with this treaty. And there's now a fossil fuel treaty on the way. As you can see from this map, there's only one country that you can see on there, which is Colombia. There are 11 other countries that are supporting this treaty, but they're all tiny islands that are going to disappear if we keep burning fossil fuels. So of course they're on board. But we need many, many more countries to be also joining the fossil fuel movement. Here's some more. It's called the BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but that's got quite a few more countries, including some states like California, Quebec province, and so on. They're working to ban fossil fuels as well. And hopefully they'll all join on with the fossil fuel treaty. And there are many, many more countries that are claiming to work in this direction, even the United States claiming to be working towards the elimination of fossil fuels. As you probably all know, this last COP28 in Dubai was the first time they even mentioned fossil fuels. They don't want to talk about fossil fuels, but we have to go after these companies. So I'm going to skip ahead. Divestment is the key tool, but there's also, and as I mentioned, there's $3 trillion divested from nuclear weapons, but there's $40.5 trillion that's already been divested from fossil fuels, which is why the fossil fuel movement is so powerful. We know this because we've had this experience of divestment campaigns and boycotting over the years, and we've seen what it can do. But I'm just going to jump ahead because, as you can see here, these are cities in the U.S. that have divested from fossil fuels already, the green ones. Very small number that have divested from nuclear weapons, but they include New York City and cities like that. In fact, New York City is the orange that's divested from fossil fuels and nuclear weapons, or has committed to doing that. And we're calling this fossil and fissile divestment. And it's a new concept, and it's growing internationally, and we've got to get that moving in the US, because that is the future of how we can put pressure on these companies. New York City, $200 billion in their pension funds, and they've committed to divesting those from the nuclear weapons, as well as they've already done it from fossil fuels. Oakland, California, Chicago, and so on. These are the cities that signed up in the 1980s to be nuclear-free zones. Now, many of these are just resolutions, but some of them, as I mentioned, like New York, Chicago, Oakland, but also smaller towns, made these commitments not just to divest from the nuclear weapons companies, but to refuse contracts with them and refuse to do business with them. And that's where the boycotting comes in. It's a hugely important part of this. Divestment, boycotting, legally binding. I'm going to try to finish up. These companies make all kinds of things for cities and bridges and hospitals and schools and power stations and so on. Hospitals are a key aspect to this, because these companies like Honeywell make hospital equipment. Well, if hospitals where doctors are committed already to nuclear disarmament and addressing the fossil fuel crisis, if they started saying that we're not going to buy your equipment from Honeywell, that could have a huge impact on these companies. Draper Labs, Medical Devices, Moog, and so on. Colleges and cities, also buy equipment from these companies. This is General Dynamics IT services for a university. Not many people here buy things from most of these companies, but they sell under all kinds of other brand names. So you need to keep an eye out. We're going to try to produce more information about this. It's all in the book. But this is what worked in the 1980s. So back in the 1980s, as you all know, many of you were working on these issues, I'm sure. Not only were they people marching in the streets and filling up Central Park in New York, not only were they watching the day after or signing petitions or getting the freeze campaign voted on in Congress, they were also taking these steps to actually target the companies and divest and boycott. So I don't know if people here were involved in the boycott of Morton Salt, but Morton was making salt and nuclear weapons. General Electric was making light bulbs and nuclear weapons. These companies dropped out of the nuclear weapons business because of the pressure on these companies. And I just want to end with General Electric because that's one of my favorite examples. General Electric was faced with a major boycott of their light bulbs in the 1980s. And they said, we're not going to have anything more to do with nuclear weapons. They put it on their website, and it is still there to this day. I don't know if you can read this, but this is directly from the General Electric website, where it says, we do not manufacture, assemble, sell, or service cluster bombs, landmines, or nuclear weapons. And they have to put that up there on their website to remind people that they don't want to be seen as being one of the bad guys. And we've got to get that message across to all the other companies that are out there making nuclear weapons and burning the planet down with the fossil fuel infrastructure. So we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons and fossil fuels by getting individuals, schools, colleges, faith communities, businesses, banks, hospitals, towns, cities, and ultimately states to divest with fossil and fissile divestment, to boycott the products and services of these companies, to refuse to do business with them or enter into contracts with them, to write letters. I mean, this is also hugely important, writing letters to the executives, to shareholders, to board members, making sure that they know what we think about their activities, and shaming them on social media and taking action at their offices and their plants and their headquarters, which I know many of you are already doing. This is how we are going to get rid of nuclear weapons and how we are going to stop the burning of fossil fuels, because these companies will feel the pressure and they will turn to their politicians who have them in their pocket and they'll say, do something. And that's what's happened in the past. And I'm confident we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Wallace. That's a fantastic presentation. A lot of very valuable information there. And I'm glad we're going to be able to share those slides with people. For those of us who've been wondering, what can we do in the face of these two existential crises? There's a lot of good ideas there and good tools. There's plenty that we can do. So I believe that Helen has been gathering up questions from the chat for you and for Ivana Hughes. And I'm going to take the liberty to asking the first question, and it's kind of a tough one. It's so the United States maintains a very aggressive foreign policy, relying heavily on military domination. We have 850 or so foreign military bases and a commitment to dominate virtually every region of the globe. So neither the US nor the other 8 nuclear-armed nations have signed the treaty, as you know. And it's kind of hard to imagine the US getting rid of its nuclear weapons while still maintaining the kind of foreign policy, militarized foreign policy that it has now. And it's difficult to imagine the other countries getting rid of their nuclear weapons before the United States does. In some ways, that puts the onus on us here in this country. But targeting the companies seems like a very effective way, because the companies are actually running the government to a large extent. But it seems like while we're addressing climate change and the possibility of nuclear war, we need to also be pushing for a peaceful foreign policy. And does your kind of Warheads, the Windmill strategy, take that into account?
I can let Ivana answer too, but yes, we for anyone who has looked at the book, I talk a lot about that. As I mentioned, the international cooperation is key to all of these, and that is especially the case with Russia and China and the United States. If we can't change the way that we look at Russia and China, we are not going to solve any of these things. And the Ukraine war has exacerbated not only the danger between US and Russia militarily, but it's also set back the climate agenda in so many different ways. It's hugely important. And so our Warheads to Windmills coalition, which is really just getting started, and we're trying to find our way, but we're certainly linked in with the efforts to stop the war in Ukraine and in Gaza, and we certainly see the importance of all the things that you've said. I mean, the question is whether pressure on the companies and then on the government will help change that foreign policy, or whether we've got to really change people's attitudes towards Russia and China. It's all linked. I mean, the companies that are promoting and my wife Vicky spent 3 days in the basement, as Anthony and others have done, of these the deterrence summit, where all these military, nuclear and other arms contractors gather every year to talk about how they're going to get more money out of the government, out of our tax money, for more and more weapons. And they're so focused on we've got to stop China, we've got to stop Russia, and it's all linked. And the narratives that we get fed through the media are funded largely from these companies and all their tentacles that go everywhere. So working on the companies may not be enough to do what you're saying, but I mean, I think that's one of the avenues that we also need to address, to be able to change the thinking that people are being fed all this propaganda and they don't realize it.
Right. Thank you. Good answer. Did you have anything to add, Ivana?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to make actually 3 comments. The first is that from sort of my perspective, at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, that was really the point of the founding of the organization more than 40 years ago, that in the nuclear age, peace is an existential imperative. It's that last slide that I showed on nuclear winter. This is the end. Nuclear war is not something, and they've been saying it, for decades. It started with Reagan and Gorbachev. Nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So get rid of the weapons. I mean, it's very simple. These weapons literally threaten all of humanity. It's the end of human civilization as we know it. Maybe some life persists. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's even worse than we think it would be. And so the imperative of peace, when the whole thing is threatened, I think is real and is critical, and it's critical to address it. From my perspective, the United States should absolutely be the one leading the world on nuclear disarmament. We all watched Oppenheimer at this point. We developed these weapons. We were the only country ever to use them. We literally wrote the script, the playbook, starting with the Marshall Islands, starting actually with Trinity and then the Marshall Islands, and so on, for the nuclear testing era. So we have this moral responsibility to lead the world on disarmament. I've thought for a long time, and I recently read it in Timon's book, so that part of the reason I said we really agree, the two of us really agree, there is a different argument, which is that the United States simply cannot be, given our geography, given our overwhelming, I mean, I'm with you, I'd like to get rid of it all, right? But given our overwhelming conventional military power, who's gonna threaten the United States? Nobody, absolutely nobody, unless we're talking about nuclear weapons. And when we do, you have a country like North Korea, which is 56th in population, and among the 10 bottom 10 countries in GDP per capita, and that country can destroy the United States as we know it. They currently have an estimated 30 nuclear warheads. They have missiles that can get to every corner of the United States. That's the United States is over. You can then say, oh, well, North Korea would also be destroyed. That's not going to help anybody. That's not gonna be any, comfort to the survivors. To me, it is insanity to spend however you count, let's call it on the order of $1 trillion on your military per year, and make yourself vulnerable to a country like North Korea, that with the statistics I mentioned. It's just insanity. It's poor leadership, it's lack of leadership, it's lack of vision, it's lack of any kind of long-term thinking about what this country and humanity need. So somehow we need to turn that around, and we really need better leadership. We need leadership that will actually listen and think in these, with the long term in mind.
Thank you so much for that powerful and excellent response. Helen, have you been gathering questions together? Would you like to present some of the more popular questions?
Well, one of the more popular questions has to do with transition and conversion. How do we manage to convince or actually retool or whatever the process of converting from building or whatever, designing everything from nuclear weapons to life-affirming kinds of work?
I can just, my short answer is that we have to put pressure on the companies. There's no other way. They're not going to do it of their own accord. We've tried that before. Many of you were involved in the 1980s with the economic conversion projects. It's been tried. There's been some great examples of what's possible, but the companies, as long as there's a gravy train of trillions of dollars coming from our tax money going straight into nuclear weapons, they're not going to change. And as soon as that starts to change, I mean, if they start feeling the pressure, they if these companies want to survive, they've got to change. They've got to move into another area of work. And the irony is that with the fossil fuel companies, the big, Exxon and BP and so on, Shell, they're trying to present themselves as green energy companies. They're moving into solar and wind, and which is great, but they're not stopping their fossil fuel enterprise. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to really, really push. And I mean, there's no simple answers to that, obviously, because we haven't got that yet. But I think, with the Warheads to Windmills, we're trying to present that as a logical, sensible thing that we are going to have to do.
Yeah, I think if I may add as well, I mean, I think this sort of applies to both companies as well as countries, right? Companies that are involved with nuclear weapons and countries that have nuclear weapons. At this point in time, it's sort of two problems. One, the whole myth of deterrence, and both Timon and I work very hard to kind of, put that myth to rest where it belongs. But the other issue is this notion that somehow having nuclear weapons is seen as a status symbol, as something that demonstrates that this is an advanced country. And we need a kind of change in thinking where having nuclear weapons or being a company that's involved in making them should become a symbol of shame. We should be ashamed that our country has weapons that could destroy humanity. That kind of thinking that somehow we're this, developed, industrial, scientifically advanced nation really needs to also go. We need to think of these weapons as a symbol of shame, and the sooner we get rid of them, the better.
Thank you. I know that one of the earliest questions in the chat today was concerning nuclear power, nuclear energy, which is being now promoted in some circles as a solution to the climate crisis, as an alternative to fossil fuels, and the negative consequences of the great potential negative consequences of nuclear power are kind of being dismissed lightly. What observations can you share about nuclear power as an option in the future?
You want to start this time, Ivana?
Sure. I mean, Timur has a brilliant section in his book on this, and it really hits all the right notes on nuclear power. I mean, to me, it's a problem, not a solution, and has been a problem ever since. In many ways, I look on the history of the Manhattan Project and what had happened there. And I think that actually the reason we have nuclear power is that those physicists were felt so guilty about what they had done. The nuclear power was somehow going to make it better, and it never did. And they were delusional. Absolutely brilliant, amazing scientists. A guy named Hans Bethe, who was a Nobel Prize in physics winner, who walked around in the 1970s promoting nuclear energy and saying that we will never have an accident, nuclear power accident. And then a few years later, we had 3 Mile Island, and then another 7 years later, it was Chernobyl, and then 15 years later, it was Fukushima. And of course, we also, in addition to the accidents, we have the uranium mining problem. We have the nuclear waste problem. It's just simply, it's a problem. It's not a solution. And nowadays, to think of the time scale, the cost, all of it, it's just not going to solve the problem that we have. It really is the move to renewables. It's really the move to solar and wind, and then all kinds of other strategies that help us to reduce those emissions, so that we get to the goals for 2030 and 2050. But anyway, Tim and I didn't mean to steal.
No, you covered it. But just to add, one of our goals of the Warheads to Windmills coalition is trying to bring together anti-nuclear weapons campaigners with anti-fossil fuel campaigners, and part of the agenda is helping to educate climate activists about the real dangers of nuclear power. They have no idea. There's been very few really, but they get a lot of attention. But a few climate activists who've been promoting nuclear power as a solution. I agree with everything that Ivana said about that, and I think most of us in the here on this call probably do, but we've got to convince the climate activists, and that's one of our jobs in terms of working with them.
Thank you. Helen, do you have any other questions that we should put forward? We need to wrap up pretty soon.
Well, one I thought was particularly interesting is, do we need to get rid of capitalism and militarism in order to solve the climate and nuclear problems?
I hope not, because then we're not gonna get them done.
Yeah. Well, we already said that we need a much less militaristic foreign policy as part of the package for sure.
Yep.
So I think that's been answered.
Well, I think, yeah. If I could just say, because this comes up a lot, the different approaches to campaigning and the different strategies for how are we going to succeed. And the truth of it is, we don't know. None of us have succeeded yet with either of these issues, and so we don't know what's going to work. But I'm sort of caught in the middle between a lot of our colleagues in the nuclear disarmament movement want to take little baby steps here and there, and stop, get a no first use policy, for instance, out of the government, which sounds great, at first, but they're very tiny steps, and we keep saying, well, we need a lot more than that, and we've got to push, and just to push for little things isn't going to get us anywhere. At the other end of the spectrum, there are lots of people saying, well, we got to get rid of capitalism, or end militarism, or change the whole structures of society and patriarchy and so on, which I totally agree with. But this is a step towards that. And, I don't think we can do that all at once either. So like, it's finding that middle ground, and we're not going to all agree where that is, but we have to find something that we think might work and try it,
Yeah, I remember we posed this question when the Veterans for Peace and the Golden Rule crew were meeting with the 13 UN missions. And I think the representative from South Africa said, well, it would be a paradigm shift to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So that would be a huge step on the way towards a peaceful foreign policy, not necessarily the last step.
Right.
So all these
If
things
I
we have to work on all these things simultaneously, of course.
Mm.
Yeah,
Ivana?
and if I can just add that really, I mean, what, allows me to work on this now at this time of such grave dangers and challenges, is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I mean, that is our beacon of hope for people who've been doing this for decades. If someone told you we would have a treaty, an international agreement among states that's in force now and that's growing, you probably would have said that would be amazing, and we have it. And we need to. The difficult part is people simply don't know about this treaty. You ask an average American, they've never heard about it, and there's a reason why they've never heard about it, because our media don't tell them about it, and
Mhm.
our politicians don't tell them
Mhm.
about it. And
Right.
so we have to do everything we can to promote this treaty and to push it forward, so that for the nuclear weapon states, the pressure comes from the outside, from the international community, and then we also have to grow our own pressure from the inside. I think of it, I call it a donut, a pressure donut, outside and inside, and we have to do that. That's the way to, to get to this, what still in many ways is a dream, but it's a dream that can come true, of a world free of nuclear weapons.
Well, those sound like perfect final words here, Ivana. Well, how about where can people get more information about the TPNW? How about the websites for Warheads to Windmills and for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation?
Yeah, our website is wagingpeace.org.
I'm jealous.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. I'll put it in the chat.
And
Wait, and what about your website, Timon?
well, we got different ones, but warheads to windmills.org. We'll get you everywhere, everything you need. And you can go to your local bookshop or your local library and order a copy of Warheads to Windmills, Preventing Climate Catastrophe and Nuclear War.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm looking forward to reading that book. So it's out there now. It's available through
Yeah.
bookshops and websites, as well as from your own website, probably.
You can't buy it from our own website because you have to go through a publisher, but we can help you get, if you want many copies, we can help you do that.
Okay,
And
terrific.
if I can put in a word about the book. So I picked up the book and I knew I had to read it, but I thought, I know so much about climate change, and and I loved reading it, and I learned a ton, and really it's just a marvelous and chock full of information and data, and it's amazing. So you definitely want Timon's book.
Great. And for those of us in
You didn't pay me to do this.
for those of us in California, we should know that Timon is on a speaking tour with his book, starting just in a couple of days. And you can find the dates to that on the Warheads to Windmills website, correct?
Yep.
Correct. And I saw in the chat a minute ago that one of our leading members, Gary Butterfield of Veterans for Peace, reminded us that the Climate Crisis and Militarism project of Veterans for Peace is collaborating with 350.org on a webinar later in March.
Ooh,
So we'll do our best to make you all aware of that so that you can join us then as well. And thank you so much, everybody, especially Ivana Hughes and Tim and Wallace for this amazing and very, very helpful presentation. And for all of the many people who joined us for these very valuable 2 hours. Thank you so much. We will be making the recording available to you all, as well as the meeting chat with got lots of different information in there you might find useful. And also even the PowerPoint slideshow that was presented by Timon and Ivana. We look forward to continuing to working with you with Veterans for Peace and our Nuclear Abolition Working Group as well. Thank you very much, and thanks to Shelley Rocket, the Office Manager of Veterans for Peace, for hosting and helping us get this webinar straight. And it went very, very well, and we're very, very pleased. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you all.
Abolish nuclear
Oh,
weapons.
thank you so much. Yes, indeed. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Right.